All right, Andy. So we are back for episode 2 of our SNL, I guess, exploration. Are you ready to get live with Saturday Night?
Like I have a Bassomatic in my pocket. Yes.
Let's jump in then, Andy, to favorite cast members. And I think you and I both did not understand the assignment because we basically picked an all-star cast. And I thought I would let you go ahead and go with your full cast first.
Sure. And I picked 7, and mostly because that's the size of the original cast. And that seems to be, there has been everything from six players to something like 15 or 16 in some seasons. 7 feels like a workable number. Even that, I had trouble figuring out who to leave off. But mine, in no particular order, but kind of, Eddie Murphy, who was on the show for 4 seasons and basically carried it through kind of a dark period, probably kept it on the air after the original cast left. Phil Hartman, who widely considered the glue, did 6 or 7 seasons in the late 80s, early 90s. Will Ferrell, Dana Carvey.
Well, isn't that special?
Chris Farley.
Dad, I wish you could just shut your big yapper.
Bill Murray.
Star Wars, nothing but Star Wars. Give me the Star Wars, don't let them end.
You know, Bill Murray's obviously the famous story of him fighting Chevy Chase. It's kind of interesting, though. You talked about he's
and
very.
My last one, just real quick, is Kristen Wiig. No problem. Wanted to get the last one in there, Kristen Wiig, who is probably the newest performer on my list, and she hasn't been on the show in a decade. So,
I tell you what, our lists are you might not be surprised, pretty similar. And I even picked some deep cuts just to make sure that we had some differences. But no, I love the story about Bill Murray standing up for his cast when Chevy Chase came back, because anybody's followed Chevy Chase's career knows that not a single person has ever worked with that dude who ended up liking that dude at the end of the process, right? Like, he is known to be a bit of a prick. So the famous story, they fought, Caddyshack comes around, but there's a story in the Royal Tenenbaums when Gene Hackman was being a real jerk to like Gwyneth Paltrow and Ben Stiller. And I guess Bill Murray wasn't even shooting that day, and he went to set and threatened to kick Gene Hackman's ass if he wouldn't stop being an asshole. So I kind of love that you saw, again, for as much as Bill Murray's known to be kind of a weird dude and he's kind of aloof, I think that he his loyalty to his cast members is always something to aspire to and to be proud of. Yeah. All right. So we're going to begin with mine. Now, look, my favorite all-time SNL actor, and I'm sure it's also influenced by some of his movies he did afterwards. Dana Carvey, to me, the best impressionist, bar none. You actually saw it in this last election cycle when he was playing Joe Biden in the best Joe Biden we've seen. He was also, I mean, he was playing other characters too, all in the same election. Phil Hartman, which we shared. Chris Farley, which I think we shared. Will Ferrell, Kristen Wiig.
Mine's burning a lot, though. It's like a little ball of fire under my bra. Can't say the Pledge of Allegiance or I'll burn my hands.
And then my 2 that I have that you don't have is, I think Kate McKinnon was a revelation.
They were all dropping in, scrambling to mash up my cheek meat like it's pizza dough.
And what I think has been a really strong last few years of SNL. But I think she's done an amazing job. And I think before there was Keenan, there was Tim Meadows.
No, that is not good. I'm sorry. But I must say, after all those Viagra's that I just took, it doesn't sound that disgusting, you know.
I think Kenan Thompson needs to get some honorable mention here. He's been on the show for 21 years.
And gotten better every year. That's the thing.
Yeah. And so if if they're celebrating their 50th anniversary, he's been on 40% of the seasons.
Yeah.
He even took some time off to do a sitcom that didn't do well that Lauren Michaels produced. But he's another one of those guys that I think if Phil Hartman hadn't been the glue, he'd be one of those glue type guys that holds cast together over periods of time.
You can see it in him. And so when he first came on, I was slightly annoyed, mostly because I liked it when we got a fresh face and people had already kind of knew who he was from his Nickelodeon show. And I do think he's gotten better. But what I think is awesome is he can play the straight man in sketches to hold it together. But then he can be like, my favorite is this misogynist security guard. I want to get up on that thing. You know, that whole bit. So he does a great job, I think, of bridging the gap.
Scared straight stuff always cracks me up. The talk show host always cracks me up. And a little bit of how my list, the thought process of my list, there are some people that I think, depending on what age you are, you automatically would assume are Saturday Night Live's cast members. I didn't pick anybody who was only on the show for 1 year, and I didn't pick anybody who is primarily a writer or primarily only did weekend updates. So Tina Fey would be on a global list, but more for writing than anything else. Billy Crystal, Martin Short, Christopher Guest, Harry Shearer might have had one of the best total seasons, but that was a cast of ringers that was brought in for 1 year, and none of them were on the show for more than 1 year. So it's hard. These were my picks were people who stayed for a period of time and really made a mark on the show over that period.
Totally. I feel like it's funny because when I started watching SNL, my mom thought it was funny because she watched it. When it started coming out, she was exiting her teenage years, so she thought it was interesting that I was into something that she was. But I do think one of the things that's interesting about this fandom is we have that core cast that we swear is the best cast that's ever been on, and if it wasn't my specific cast, I don't think it's as good. And I do love that there is some of that, but you're right. They had to have been on the seasons together for multiple years. You have, Adam Sandler and Spade and all those guys. That's a core cast, even though some came on earlier and some might have left. Having that run, that 3 or 4 year run, really makes it essential for them to have made a mark.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we start talking about cast, because I know that was part of the assignment was the cast that I think is probably overall. I was right out of high school when they were on, but it was a transition cast. It had some of the older cast members from the late 80s casts, and was really transitioning into a newer age with the guys you just mentioned, Sandler, Spade, Chris Rock, Chris Farley, and that was the season 17 cast. So I don't know if we're going there right now, but that is
let's go there right now. Yeah.
That was kind of revelation, and I think it's widely accepted. But you had holdovers, Carvey, Phil Hartman, Victoria Jackson, and Mike Myers, Kevin Nealon also, who is woefully underrated on that show. But then you brought in new guys like I mentioned, Spade, Schneider, Tim Meadows, Ellen Cleghorn, Adam Sandler, and Farley, and that it's just incredible the way they melded the kind of two styles, two generations into one really, really strong season from start to finish. And there's very few seasons that you can say that it was really incredible from start to finish. Because like I said, you're doing something 20 times and you're making it up every Monday. There's going to be some stinkers in there, right? I mean, it's just by nature. Hopefully they don't all stink, but this was just consistently hit after hit after hit. And it's so rewatchable at this point. There's not a lot of things that you watch now. I can still watch. We were actually watching part of the season yesterday while we were kind of snowed in, and the Tridelt sketch, the Delta Delta Delta. Can I help you? Help you? Help you? And with three performers who frankly aren't on the show anymore and weren't on the show for very long, and Melanie Hutzel, and a couple of others. I can't even remember their names right now. But there were so many things that were kind of cultural touchstones coming from that cast that it's really kind of an incredible group that got put together for that 1 year.
Yeah, it was really hard for me to narrow this down too, because there were so many casts that I love. And again, partly when I was watching a lot of this, I'm sure they started. If I didn't go back, they all kind of blended together. And for some reason, I settled on the 22 cast for a couple of reasons. And I think it's because there are several actors that I think really were underrated on the show. I mean, yes, it had Will Ferrell and it had Tim Meadows, but Anna Gasteyer is fantastic. Daryl Hammond was my honorable mention for best political impression that we're going to discuss a little bit later on. What's funny is I teach SNL to my screenwriting classes, and they have no idea who Bill Clinton is. They have no idea that he was a womanizer and ate a lot, but the Bill Clinton in the McDonald's sketch is always a favorite for that group of people. So
there's going to be a lot of things we're not telling Mrs. Clinton.
There's a lot of things we're going to be telling. Yeah, I mean, and honestly too, I think clearly underrated by even SNL himself, but Norm Macdonald on that cast, he wasn't on very long and we all know why, but I think Not my favorite Weekend Update guy, but top 3, probably top 4.
I think in a lot of ways he's probably one or two. And it's unfortunately you lose your job because of politics, because keep making fun of the president of NBC's best friend who happened to murder 2 people. Small detail, but just wouldn't let it go. An article I read about Norm Macdonald was just his infinite capacity to not give a fuck about anything that came out of his mouth. Was fascinating when you watch it on live TV, and just never knowing what you were going to get out of that. Yeah, that was a pretty incredible cast, considering that you still had, like you said, Meadows, Tracy Morgan, who I don't think gets a lot of credit, and I will admit he's a very acquired taste. But
Yeah.
the Spaceman Jones stuff used to crack me up because it was like every $1 million movie on Channel 13 is like, oh, they just happen to be in space. They might as well be in an office building because they're just sitting around smoking.
Right.
But you had Anna Gasteyer, like you said. You had Mark McKinney was on there for that year. Molly Shannon was on there. Jim Brewer, who again is another acquired taste, but had his moments as Goat Boy.
I mean, what's better though than Tracy Morgan's Brian Fellow?
Yeah,
a guy
Brian
with a
Fellow
5th grade education who loves animals. Hello, bird.
Why are you back talking to me, bird?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. And that's it's such a can of worms when you discuss this show, because you go down, it's easy to go down rabbit holes. I wanted to ask you, I don't know if we prepped this one or not. Do you have an overrated sketch?
Yeah, the Coneheads. I to this day, it's fine. I don't pretend I don't see the humor in it, but it's one of those things they went to the well so often and made a really bad movie of 30 years or 20 years after the fact. And I'm a person, if we talk about this show, I will find something I can like in just about any movie.
Yeah.
It's just, it was a fun concept for the first time. And I really come to realize that some of the things from those original 4 years, 5 years, it would be better had I been high. And Coneheads are one of those things. Had I been high, would have been fantastic. I think there's a couple seasons like that in that 4 years. The Bumblebee stuff would have made me laugh a lot more if I were high. But the Conehead for me was just, if it had been one skit, I think it would have carried a lot more weight for me. But because it's something they went to the well so often for. And then there's another one that probably won't be too popular, Wayne's World. Which,
Okay.
Again, it's fine. It's better than some of the stuff they put on, but I don't know that it's, a cultural touchstone, or at least didn't continue to be after time.
What's interesting about it, though, is it is largely, and I think unarguably, the best SNL movie.
Yeah, movie part is different.
Yeah.
And I think that's because you had more Mike Myers and less Lorne Michaels.
Yeah. You had, I mean, I actually think even the second one is clearly not as good, but it's funny. But Dana Carvey, particularly in the second one, gets a little bit more to do as Garth with the relationship with Kim Basinger. When she says, "Take me, Garth, where? I'm low on gas and you need a jacket." Like, I don't know. But Wayne's World, for as much as you're right, it was kind of just a mess sketch that I think appealed to me more because when I saw it, when it came out, I was like 13 maybe. Versus you get a little bit older and you realize, wow, it really isn't that funny. It's just about having a boner and liking rock music. So
yeah, and I probably should clarify the less Lorne Michaels. Lorne Michaels rarely, I think, writes anything for the show, and probably certainly didn't at that point. But one of the things that's very interesting in the process of making the Saturday Night Live show is that the writer of the show is the producer of that sketch, and they have ultimate say over costumes and set design and all that stuff. And so it is a training ground for so many people in Hollywood because they did have to be responsible for that 3 to 5 minutes of live network television kind of independently. But another part of that process is that whatever you wrote gets rewritten by a group of people 3 or 4 times before it goes to air, including between dress and the live show, which there's a 45-minute gap.
Yeah.
And I think Wayne's World as a movie worked better because it was a dedicated team of writers, but it was limited in scope to Mike Myers and a kind of a circle of people he trusted versus whoever happened to be on staff that week, which might have been 12 different people.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think it was a little bit more focused in storytelling. And I think Mike Myers is an interesting case anyway. He's somebody I had trouble leaving off, but I also think he's somebody who came to the show almost fully formed. And had he not been on Saturday Night Live, I still think you have an Austin Powers series. I still think you have So I Married an Axe Murderer.
That's a great point.
It's like so many of his characters were just done already by the time he got to the show.
Because we saw them in his movies. I mean, like almost immediately. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, the Scottish character clearly became Fat Bastard in Austin Powers. Yeah, that's a great point. My most overrated, I do have more Cowbell, and it is because it is so close to being genius. And to me, even as it's funny to me, Andy, when I think about things I thought about as a kid or younger, and I'm like, yeah, it's no surprise I got into film, because little things that always bugged me. Superman having the wrong powers in Superman 2, or things like that. And in this one, it's not just Jimmy Fallon who can't keep a straight face the entire time, but it's also Horatio Sands. So it's almost there's 5 characters on that stage, and 2 of them can't keep.
Another notorious breaker, yes, Horatio Sands.
But they break for 5 minutes, and so it you got Chris Parnell, who if anybody should have broken, because he's the butt of all of Will Ferrell's anger in that, like when he's got the cowbell right in his ear. Chris Parnell, the consummate professional. Anytime Jessica and I see him on a movie now, we're like, oh yes, he's in that. Yeah, that's the one for me though. I think it's so close to being perfect that therefore it fails.
I think that I'd be interested to see when you watch I guess it's the 3rd episode of that 4-part thing on Peacock. It is all about more cowbell. And they actually spend 5-10 minutes talking about Chris Parnell not breaking and refusing to break, and how hard Will Ferrell was trying to get him to break, because he knew if he did that, that would be like setting a record, because Parnell never broke.
Yeah. And Chris Parnell should have been breaking on his own stuff, because he of everybody in SNL, he had that dry, understated delivery down pat, where if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed his joke. And to me, that's the best kind of humor. To me, it feels like it's smarter humor, and I think he really was the best at it.
He was one of the best parts of 30 Rock, and I love 30 Rock, but Dr. Spachiman, who somehow was both Tracy Morgan's personal physician as well as the NBC corporate doctor for some period of time. Really, really made that show in a lot of ways.
What can set an episode, as we move on to our next topic, is the guest host. And we've already talked a little bit about it. Steven Seagal thought he was funnier than he was, and then wasn't willing to do what he needed to do to be funny. Versus there are some, even if you don't watch the show for periods of time, you find out they're guest hosting and they jump on, or they expose a little different in them. And we're going to actually finish this, the second part of this episode, with a montage of some of my favorite sports SNL moments, because we're a sports show mostly, and Peyton Manning and Eli Manning, frankly, Eli Manning when they're going through his text chain was hilarious. So who are some of the guest hosts that that stood out for you? I picked 3. Who were some of the ones you had?
I've got 4, and I'll tell you the 4th one. And it's primarily based on one sketch, although the whole episode is solid. It is Peyton Manning, the United Way sketch.
Oh my God!
Where he takes the kids out to play football in the field. That to me is a peak SNL moment. It was evidently produced by the Lazy Sunday crew, so that it has a little bit of that unexpected piece to it. But Manning does so well acting, and I will not say that about him much, because he's not an actor, but he knows he's not an actor. And I think that's kind of the key when you have an athlete on. You've seen The Rock is more of an actor and can lean into it, but you also have had shows with Walter Payton and Joe Montana, and Joe Montana frankly has the personality of a board, and fortunately the writers leaned into that a little bit, but they're not able to carry a show. Peyton Manning was able to carry the show. But the 3 that I look for, that kind of Hall of Fame guest hosts, Tom Hanks, I think, is number 1. There's a number of moments that he had on that show. Mr. Short-Term Memory being right up there with the top of them. Steve Martin, who also has My Best Cold Open, which I think is one of the topics that we had. But all the way back to the original cast with King Tut. And you talk about cultural phenomenon. Steve Martin was the top of the top at that period of time. And then John Goodman, who you don't see much anymore, but for a period of probably from the mid-90s, when Roseanne was at the peak of its popularity, into the mid-aughts, he was a regular every season, and I think he's one of the five timers clubs. But I think he's like eight or nine episodes.
Yeah, I think was it Tom Hanks that's on it's like was in 17. One of them's in 17. Oh no, actually no, it's the first one on my list. I think Alec Baldwin almost felt like a cast member.
Yep.
And Alec Baldwin's career at the beginning of it kind of hit or miss for a lot of people. He's a miss for me because I was a big book nerd and he was not Jack Ryan. And yet,
Right.
so much as Hunt for October is a great movie, he was a miss. But
Tom Cruise wasn't Reacher either, so there's a history of that.
At least he and his producing partner realized that when they cast the show, because people actually forget that Tom Cruise is still a producer on the show and had a say in the casting.
Sure,
we got the actual right character to play it, but we should have a Tom Cruise dedicated episode at some point. I think that could be interesting. But no, I think Alec Baldwin, not only when he's hosting, but was the second best Trump, and we'll get to my favorite Trump in a minute, but was just great on the show. I also have John Goodman, and I'm going to go with the aforementioned Ryan Gosling, because I think he plays into his own stereotypes so much, and is it's one of those things where him being on SNL won me over as an actor. And I don't know that I would have gone back and revisited some of his movies if I hadn't seen him on SNL, because I'd seen The Notebook and I loathe it, and then I saw him on SNL, and so I've been backtracking. And look, so many great ones. I mentioned Santa Baby, I mentioned Papyrus, but also the whole Wayne's World bit. No, the whole Beavis and Butthead thing they did just recently. Complete knock it out of the park. So those are my three: Goodman, Baldwin, and Ryan Gosling.
I would also say that if Nate Bargatze comes back for the next 3 or 4 years, which touring comedians might do, he'd have a chance to be up there because he's had a couple of really good shows for the two that he's been on.
Yes, completely. I mean, we even have he was on, one of his sketches was on my list. So let's talk a little bit about, first of all, before we get into best cold opens, did you have a monologue that really stuck out to you?
I kind of grouped them together, so I don't know that I have a specific monologue, but I mean, there's been a number. And it's weird how the show evolved because George Carlin was the original host. I think most people know that, but his monologue was just him doing stand up.
Yeah.
And
Chappelle does that now, right? That's all.
Going literally 50 years in the future, this past weekend, Chappelle did 15 minutes of stand up.
You sure did.
I mean, that was it. So there's been a lot of different things through the years. It was hard for me to pick one, so I probably just didn't.
I will say, though, I had one, and only because it really did stick out for me was the cold open that Luke Perry did, where Phil Hartman played Obi-Wan Kenobi, and it was like trying to get him to fight members of the audience. Kick his ass, Luke. Take his wallet. So if you haven't seen that, first of all, Phil Hartman is Obi-Wan Kenobi is enough, but
I will say nostalgically, when Kirstie Alley hosted and all of the cast members from Cheers happened to be in the audience, and it wasn't just the made up ones. It was Ted Danson and George Wendt and John Ratzenberger were all in, and Woody Harrelson were all there. But then she came back a year later, and nobody showed up for her, so they just dressed up cast members as Norm and Sam and Cliff.
Yeah, whenever we get to the question and answer portion of the monologue, which doesn't happen often, is really good. And I would say probably my favorite cold open. It goes back to the George W. Bush Al Gore debate with strategery and having a lock box that was designed by, like, to look like a cover of the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. For some reason, lockbox is still in mine and Jessica's vocabulary. 25 years later? So that is my all-time favorite cold open. Is that one?
And I'm realizing now as we're talking about it that my cold open is actually a monologue. So sorry. But it's Steve Martin, Not Gonna Phone It In Tonight. A, I'm a big fan for musicals. B, somehow this came out in December of 1991. So I would have been a sophomore in college. I know this song word for word. I know the choreography for most of it. It is so ingrained in my memory about this, Steve Martin being this jaded Hollywood actor who doesn't have to try. He can just read things off cue cards and it's all fine, which is how the show is run, by the way.
Right.
But tonight, for some reason, he's just going to try. And having Chris Farley fawn around him and look at him like big doe eyes, and being so impressed that he's actually going to give some effort.
Although now I'm thinking about Chris Farley interviewing Paul McCartney, but that's a whole other.
Yeah, but it's just such a great song, and knowing that they didn't have the idea for that song on Monday and had a fully produced musical number with multiple sets running through the studio by, I guess, Friday to dress it on Saturday and run it on the live show. It's an incredible piece of comedy.
Completely. And Steve Martin, of course, you mentioned Steve Martin. I'm automatically thinking about his Christmas wish.
Yes.
All the children of the world, a long sustained orgasm by Rosanna Arquette.
Yeah, think about the logistics of that. I mean, how would you even get all those kids together?
Yeah, right.
Put that down the list.
I have my big Christmas playlist, and I ripped the audio for that. So it's like right after Bing Crosby, we got some Steve Martin
right
before we go into George Strait's Christmas Cookies.
Power of Grammys, then the money,
then the sex thing. Because listen, if it all ended tomorrow, you want to.
What do you got?
Now, one segment that I think has been strong for 50 years, that I think in some years when the ratings weren't great and the reviews weren't great, which I feel like reviewers poke fun at that show because they think it's easy. It's a low-hanging fruit, so whatever. But the Weekend Update has always been one of those things that was appointment television for me, even if I wasn't necessarily watching the whole episodes at the time. It's still probably the first thing I watch.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go with mine first. My all-time favorite, and it's probably not it's probably the most obvious choice in the world, but Dennis Miller to me was Weekend Update for the longest time. And I was actually the one guy who liked it when he was on Monday Night Football, because much of that same kind of esoteric higher order thinking that Dennis Miller brought, he also brought to the booth, and God forbid football fans should know a little bit about history.
Yeah, I went Dennis Miller. His work on Weekend Update, and honestly, he was one of the first guys that was just a guy that did update. He was in a few sketches. The one that comes to mind most notably, other than the penis sketch, because they needed just another body. And for those of you that don't know, that's a sketch where they set the record for saying penis on network TV the most times. Never been touched. But also when they found the lost ending to It's a Wonderful Life, and he comes back, helps beat the hell out of John Lovitz.
Yeah, Potter. Yeah.
Yeah. But my Weekend Updates, probably my all-time, is when Tina Fey and Amy Poehler were together. Because it was something different that you saw. I know Jane Curtin was one of the original Weekend Update people after Chevy Chase left. But the two of them together, it was different. It was edgier. It more reflected what was going on in the news at that point. And their sense of humor just really kind of resonated with me at that point. And it's still something that I can watch. And there's still jokes that you don't see. They were so in-your-face feminist without being offensive about it.
Yeah.
That it was something that was just appointment television for me, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the Meet Your Second Wife sketch, and
it was so much better than when Faye was on with Fallon. I think that's the other part.
That was like a mom taking her son to work.
Yeah, and I think that was still fine, but it was just it got so much better when Fallon left that segment and Poehler took his place.
100%.
Even to the point Poehler carried it when Seth Meyers took Tina Fey's place, because I think it still had some of that same sensibility that carried with it. It wasn't just Jimmy Fallon being silly for the sake of Jimmy Fallon being silly.
Well, I think honorable mention too is the current group of Michael Che and Colin Jost. I think that they are together. I mean, I don't know that there's any funnier moment on SNL every year now than when they write the jokes for each other. Yeah,
the joke swap it's appointment television.
It's appointment television. This past one where they're making fun of Scarlett Johansson's hoo-ha, which or actually last year we had to do the racist jokes in front of the civil rights leader. Like that was just, but those two guys, because they bring two incredibly different sensibilities, and it meshes really, really well together. And I like that NBC has kind of steered into that a little bit when they will sometimes do political specials, or they'll do like Olympics coverage one year. Colin Jost, Colin and Michael Che completely, I think will be a group will be when we're doing the 100th episode of this, I guess when our kids are, because we'll be dead. Yeah. Oh, we'll be dead. There should be some that are
could live
mentioned.
to 103, but I don't know that I want to be recording a podcast at 103.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm going to be live at 103, frankly.
Oh, no, Humphrey, don't get up. Why don't you just stay there and relax? After all, you did put in a long day of work at a demanding, high-stress job. Oh, no, wait a minute. That's me.
All right, I think my last category that I had to discuss was best impression of a politician. And I think SNL is at its best when there's controversy in politics. And I think in the recent years of 24-hour news, you mentioned it earlier, it's a lot easier to do that. I would have thought that it would have been Daryl Hammond as Bill Clinton, but I have to give credit to James Austin Johnson, who's currently portraying Trump. I don't know that anybody does the weave as well as he does as Donald Trump.
And we're doing the challenges. Remember Ice Bucket? We loved Ice Bucket. Anyway, we may have to go over to Reels with Mark Zuckerberg. I like him now. Zuck. He looks better, much cooler in terms of perm and with regard to chain.
There's been so many. I mean, it started with Chevy Chase doing a really interesting Gerald Ford, basically because they just both fell down. That was the whole joke. And it developed into something so mature and so Aykroyd did Jimmy Carter early. You saw different things, but it really started evolving when Dana Carvey took on George H.W. Bush. The political debate between him and Dukakis, where Lovitz is playing Dukakis, and just
I can't believe I'm losing to this guy.
How am I losing to this guy? 1,000 points of light.
You may prove to yourself that it's impossible, but I think I'm like most Americans who'd rather see a time machine with an American flag on the side and not a hammer and a sickle.
Yeah.
City on a hill. But I think for me, Tina Fey playing Sarah Palin and Amy Poehler playing Hillary Clinton is an all-timer. And there's so...
I believe that diplomacy should be the cornerstone of any foreign policy.
And I can see Russia from my house.
How many to choose from in this era, but that whole I can see Russia from my house, that became part of pop culture talking points for a decade afterwards.
Yeah.
I don't know if there was a more perfect placement of a actress in a role than that. Although I will say Maya Rudolph as Kamala is close this year.
And then bringing Dana Carvey back as Joe Biden. One of the things that I noticed too, you talked about Dana Carvey, because that would have been probably number 3 on my list after Daryl Hammond, was there was no bigger fan of that impression than President George H.W. Bush. And having Dana Carvey to the White House dinner and doing all that stuff started a tradition that we can all imagine did not continue when Donald Trump became president. And I know that Alec Baldwin was definitely not playing a character. He's definitely being a little bit more mean-natured in it because we all know why.
Yeah.
But I think that what makes James Austin Johnson work is that he has so much of the understated thing going that it honestly feels like sometimes you feel like you're listening to Donald Trump speak. And I think again, amazing. I will say this though, my favorite moment from Daryl Hammond as Bill Clinton is when he got off on the charges and he said, "Next time y'all best use kryptonite." That was his entire press conference, and then he walked away.
Yeah, there's been so many great performances as politicians, and you can go back to Jan Hooks playing Hillary Clinton before Amy Poehler did. Phil Hartman did a pretty good Bill Clinton before Daryl Hammond as well. But Bush not only did, there's a really underrated one, and it's going to be very obscure, but Al Franken who was a politician after this, did a great Paul Tsongas. And you have to be a fan of like the 1992 election to really know who Paul Tsongas was. But
Right.
he also, I think, won New Hampshire. He was somebody who was prominent, but he also sounded like Smeagol. And there was no holding back on whatever speech impediment Paul Tsongas had because Al Franken just went all the way for it. You have that. You have Carvey also did Ross Perot, which it still stands up today.
Still does, yeah.
So just so many, and I think Farrell as Bush Jr. As W. That was great. The two of them together when they brought Carvey back for that cold open and had Dad after Bush won the election was fantastic.
And again, to my point earlier, W thought Farrell was hilarious and had him out in the White House and stuff. And I actually liked how strangely patriotic it was, the post 9/11 one, when he challenged Bin Laden to not war. He should have challenged him to a beard off because I can't grow a beard. And when I do, it comes in patchy. Like, just there was something strangely patriotic about that moment, even though it was still Will Ferrell poking fun at W. Yeah. I mean, that was my favorite cold open was that debate because of strategery.
Yeah, I honestly don't think that any politician has publicly had an issue with how they were portrayed on Saturday Night Live other than Donald Trump.
Yeah, which is on brand. He doesn't even do the White House 100%. Correspondence dinner. Like, yeah, on brand.
I mean, even Jay Farrow did a great Barack Obama. Frankly, Fred Armisen did a pretty good Barack Obama. It's a little problematic these days, but he still did it.
Well, we don't know what race Fred Armisen is, do we?
He also, in the vein of politicians for Fred Armisen, did the mayor of New York who was blind and kept walking into the camera in the middle of press conferences, which cruel, but I laughed.
No, it's like the mayor's going to see it. It's fine.
Exactly. You might hear it happen.
All right, so we got final thoughts on SNL as we wrap up the second part of this SNL series. Any parting shots? Anything that just if people have never seen the show or never seen older episodes of the show, something people need to go back and visit?
I'd go, get on Peacock and look at season 17. Go to season 10 and look at the 84-85 cast that's basically saved the show because it's about to be canceled. The season before the 84-85 cast had Anthony Michael Hall and Robert Downey Jr., neither of which needed to be on that show. Randy Quaid, pre-Insanity, Joe Cusack. And all these people sound like they're familiar names. They are because they became actors after they were on the show. They had no business being on the show, but it was Lorne Michaels' return. And there's so much in the history of the show that you can watch. And you can pick a season. You can figure out what, the guy that you saw in a movie that you liked. If you like Tommy Boy, the 91, 92, 93, 94 seasons are going to be fantastic for you. If you like Austin Powers, go back a few years because you can see the birth of all of those things and that style of comedy and those guys. And you can really do it throughout the history of the show. I don't think there is Chevy Chase and Goldie Hawn movies without 1975 SNL.
100%. And I think my parting shot would be another underrated sketch. One of my very first ever crushes was Candace Bergen. And I think, first of all, beautiful woman, incredibly funny. And the whole Bag of Glass sketch with Dan Aykroyd is on my Christmas SNL playlist. So that does wrap up our SNL episodes for the week. Again, congratulations to Billy Wagner. We will be back next week where we're going to start talking some college baseball. For Andy, I'm Jim. We'll see you on the next off day.